3 minutes past 3 p.m. here in Nairobi, East African time. A very good afternoon to you, good morning, good evening, depending on where you're tuned in and you're joining us from. Here's the latest news from across the continent of Africa, and we start with the unfolding situation in Sudan. It is not clear who is in charge in Sudan. Conflicting narratives have emerged as deadly clashes continue, having broken out early on Saturday between the army and the powerful paramilitary Rapid Support Forces (RSF. Nearly 100 civilians have been killed as violence spread from the capital Khartoum to other cities in the absence of the state media, which abruptly halted live broadcast after clashes at its headquarters in Omdurman. The SAF and the RSF have predominantly used social media to issue competing statements. These have included claiming control of strategic sites such as command centers, air bases, and presidential palace. The clashes are underpinned by a power struggle between the army chief and the country's de facto president, General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, and his deputy, who also commands the RSF, General Hamdan Dagalo, also known as Hemeti. Since hijacking a popular civil uprising to oust long-serving President Omar al-Bashir in 2019, the army has concentrated power around itself. And still staying with that matter, the International Committee of the Red Cross warned on Sunday that fighting in densely populated areas in Sudan is putting the lives of civilians at risk. The ICRC's call is one of many humanitarian organizations urging all parties to the conflict to take immediate action to protect civilians. Jermaine Wehu, ICRC spokesperson in Khartoum, told Voice of America there are grave concerns over the use of explosives in populated areas. The situation in Sudan remains tense, with ongoing clashes between government forces and country's paramilitary group, Rapid Support Forces, in several parts of the country. And as of Sunday, the number of civilians who were killed had reached 59, but right now they are nearing 100, and humanitarian organizations say the death toll could continue rising. Very well, and in other news from Nigeria, gunmen have attacked a village in northwestern Nigeria and killed at least 33 people, a local official confirmed on Sunday. More than 35 houses were destroyed in the violence in Dunje, which is in the state of Kaduna, said Francis Zimbo, the chairman of the Zangon Carter area, where the massacre took place. Zimbo provided the number of fatalities, but state authorities could not comment on the number of people who had been killed. The group has claimed responsibility for the killings, gangs of bandits have been accused of being responsible for attacks in the region, which includes the kidnapping for ransom and killing of civilians. Earlier this month, gunmen kidnapped 10 students about half-hour drive by car from where Saturday's attack occurred. Nigeria's government is still struggling to quell the violence in the country's northwest, despite a reduction in attacks last year as security forces ramped up military operations targeting the gunmen's hideouts. We head over to Senegal, where more than 100 political and civil society groups in Senegal on Sunday formed a coalition to oppose a third term for President Macky Sall. 10 months ahead of the presidential elections, the coalition, in a declaration, called on Sall to respect the constitution and refrain from running for an illegal and illegitimate third term. The president, who came to power in 2012, has not clarified his intentions but rejects claims that it will be unconstitutional for him to run again. His main political opponent, Osman Sonko, was among several opposition leaders to attend the launch of the coalition. More than 120 parties on Sunday signed the charter of the F-24 movement of vital forces, according to its instigators. It also calls for release of political detainees arrested during demonstrations over a defamation case against Sonko brought by Tourism Minister Mame Mbaye Niang, a member of the Sall's party. Tensions have been running high through the country for weeks, with protests bringing the capital Dakar to a virtual standstill. Sonko was handed a 2-month suspended sentence in the court case at the end of March after a trial his lawyers said would not rule him out of the 2024 presidential election. An appeal was lodged against the ruling, and Sonko is due to be judged on an appeal on Monday, that is today. Sonko's fate is also wrapped up in another case in which he is accused of rape, which he has contested. He and his supporters accuse the government of using the justice system to try to prevent him from running in next year's election. The presidential party accuses Sonko of seeking to paralyze the country and of drumming up anger on the streets in a bid to escape justice. And over the weekend, President Paul Kagame of Rwanda met on Saturday with his Benin counterpart Patrice Talon, promising military support to help the country contain spillover from jihadist conflict across its northern border with Burkina Faso. West African coastal nations Benin, Togo, Ghana and Ivory Coast are preparing for potential spillover as Burkina Faso struggles to contain an Islamist militant insurgency gaining ground just across the northern borders. Benin last year said it was in talks over military and logistical cooperation with Rwanda, whose troops Kagame has already dispatched to help Mozambique and Central African Republic combat unrest. Benin, Togo and Ivory Coast have already suffered attacks in border areas blamed on jihadists, while Ghana recently reinforced a military presence along its own northern frontier. Talon and Kagame had a one-on-one meeting to discuss relations between the two countries and the search for strategic partnership in several areas, including security. Benin's foreign ministry said in a statement they discussed the terrorist threat and its spread, as well as the means of strengthening the cooperation to deal with it, the statement said. Head over back to Nigeria, and Nigeria's airport will be closed for 2 days starting Monday. Today, as aviation employees launch their second strike this year in protest of working conditions and pay. In an announcement dated on Friday, the unions that represents pilot engineers, control tower operators and other airport employees announced that they would skip work on Monday and Tuesday due to unpaid arrears and the federal government's decision to tear down some aviation agencies' Lagos offices to make way for airport expansion. The union threatened ensue an indefinite strike should the current strike fail to achieve the desired result. The group also deplored other problems the industry is facing, including poor facilities, jet fuel shortages, and often ground domestic flights, and a lack of foreign currency that has seen international carriers failing to repatriate their ticket sales. And the latest from South Sudan is that the recent attempt at a population census has run into political headwinds, with politicians saying the released figures point to plans to rig an election whose date is yet to be confirmed. A number of opposition politicians and some in the civil society questioned the estimates that put the total of the country's population to 12,444,018 and are demanding what they term as a proper census as per the 2018 peace agreement. UN estimates had put the population at 11,556,069, even though the current survey was partly supported by the United Nations itself. Early this month, Juba published its population estimation survey showing the country's population has risen by more than 4 million to 12.4 million people. The country's last census was in 2008 when it was still an autonomous region of Sudan. Dut Majokdit, a member of the Sudan People's Liberation Movement in opposition, National Liberation Council, cast doubts on the estimates and called for fresh census to prevent election manipulation. Also, in with the doubts is Dr. Peter Bier Ajak, an activist living in exile in the U.S. who terms the numbers extremely suspicious. Some critics doubt President Salva Kiir's home, Warab State, had a population increase of 171% from 720,898 in 2008 to 2.6 million people. Okay, and still staying on Sudan, but this time with Somalia as well. 4 years, the United Nations Security Council has been running parallel regimes of sanctions on East Africa's most troubled countries, and that is Somalia, which has been struggling to defeat Al-Shabaab in the south of the country, and South Sudan, which has been torn apart by various armed groups. For South Sudan, frequent clashes between splintered armed groups fueled the extension of an arms embargo last year. Next month, the embargo on South Sudan will be up for review again, and Juba, just like Mogadishu, hopes to have the ban lifted. Juba is choosing to lobby behind the scenes to members of the United Nations Security Council, while Somalia is publicly calling for the lifting last week. The African Union Peace and Security Council say the UN should have considered Somalia's repeated request to be freed from the ban. The council, which deals with Africa's security threats, said Somalia's embargo should be lifted to ensure that the country is sufficiently equipped to effectively address the security threats posed by Al-Shabaab and other terrorist groups active in Somalia as it prepares to take over security responsibilities from ATMIS at the end of the transition by 31st December 2024. ATMIS, the African Union Transition Mission in Somalia, has a two-year drawdown program to hand over security duties to Somalia's security forces, and that is the latest news from across the continent of Africa. This arms embargo on Somalia and Sudan are a bit, I think, depending on where you stand, because in a place like Somalia, we can see some progress being made as far as fighting the Al-Shabaab is concerned. But when you look back to an event that happened last year, the attack on that very heavily guarded hotel that usually hosts diplomats and all that high-level delegates in Mogadishu, and it was attacked. And from what we were getting of the report, I think the investigations are still ongoing, so we haven't received a final report on that attack. Was that there are elements in the Somalia army that were working together with the Al-Shabaab. So when you look at the progress then that is being made, and then you look at such incidences, I think you were torn between, do we lift this ban on Somalia because of the progress that is making in its fight against Al-Shabaab, and to ensure that the government and its forces are fully equipped to be able to fight effectively the threat that Al-Shabaab existence is causing in the country? Or do we wait a little longer to see that there is even some level of stability in Somalia's forces itself before this ban is lifted, this arms embargo is lifted? So those are the questions that the United Nations Security Council perhaps is grappling right now. But I know over everything else that is happening, and knowing very well the members that are influential very much in the Security Council. Right now, Sudan, Somalia might not even be in the top of, the countries that they're really concerned about, they're urgently and working towards solving their problems. They're stuck in other things that are happening in Europe, Europe itself right now is, if we were to go by the sentiments of France's President Emmanuel Macron and his recent visit to China, and how I think he said something to the effect of, they will not be supporting the United States in every fight it decides to pick, or in every diplomatic spot it decides to take on with another country in the international system. Europe will no longer be in a position to keep supporting this unless it makes sense to them. Of course, he was speaking as the president of France, so that we will assume is the position his administration is slowly taking, and I don't know if that represents the sentiments of the European Union as a bloc, but we've not had the rest of them talk. So maybe it's a general feeling, because we didn't hear them come out and refute, or refuse to identify with the sentiments of President Emmanuel Macron's with the sentiments of President Emmanuel Macron and what he said while he was in China, and that was in line with the issue between China and Taiwan. He was asked about it, and he said, that is something that Europe no longer wants to keep, involving itself in, and they should leave that process to play out by itself, and leave China and Taiwan to work things between themselves. I think a different position from what they had been taking while they were supporting US's effort in trying to see that China and that Taiwan becomes an independent state. So it is things like this, and the nature of the international system that keeps. It is quite dynamic. It keeps growing, and you realize states and leaderships in the world will always take a stand that necessarily might not be in might not be the same, stand they took maybe 5 years ago, 10 years ago, because as the relationships continues and the needs and the world keeps growing, you realize the stand you took 10 years ago perhaps is not working very well for your own country's foreign policy or for the good of your country in terms of, trade and all that, and the things that you could benefit from certain actors or from certain states. So countries review their foreign policies in this way, and that really advises how they choose to engage diplomatically with these countries. So perhaps all these hard stand they have been taking against China, Europe, US, and all these other countries. And by the way, the US is the biggest trading partner with China, and China also is the biggest trading partner with the US. So those two, and the trade wars and the politics of power jostling, that you really have to go there when you're sober, and you have to go there looking at the interest of your country and what you stand to gain. Otherwise, if you just go into the bandwagon of the US or join the bandwagon of China, the end of the day, it's just them, the fight they're fighting is so different from what the rest of us will be choosing to join or support each other's side. So I think you have to have that knowledge and that wisdom, and look at what you stand to gain or lose depending on the side that you choose to take. But having said that, Somalia and Sudan, as much as the embargoes that were put in place, they are coming to an end. And I think the most likely situation is that these embargoes will be renewed. I don't see the United Nations Security Council right now even spending a lot of time to discuss this. Like I was saying in my very lengthy explanation there, they're now concerned with other matters, other international matters. In Africa sometimes, embargoes in South Sudan and Somalia is really not an urgent matter for them right now. So that is not where they want to spend a lot of their time. And so I don't see this embargo being lifted for Somalia or South Sudan, because nothing much has really changed. And the dynamics of this conflict, they still remain the same, like in South Sudan. This embargo should stay, because what is happening in South Sudan is not... The conflict has no external factor, okay? The conflict has no involvement of any terrorist group as compared to Somalia, okay? Somalia perhaps needs more arms and needs its national army or security forces to be more equipped so that they're able to fight Al-Shabaab effectively, granted. But in South Sudan, who are you going to give these guns? The government to distribute among these community militias that they are sponsoring to fight against each other. So the dynamics of these two conflicts are quite different. So on South Sudan, I pray that this arms embargo stays. I don't think that should be lifted. In Somalia, it's a different case, but also with other issues that I've mentioned also there. I think that perhaps the United Nations Security Council needs to take its time, maybe give it a year and see if they're able to get its house in order. But the dynamics of these two conflicts are different. In South Sudan, look at what is fueling this conflict in South Sudan. It has to do with ethnicity. It is a fight within themselves, between the South Sudanese, aided and abated and sponsored and instigated by the leadership of the country that has failed to work as a unifying factor among its people. So now this conflict and their disagreement spreads across South Sudan, picks on other issues that were existing even before South Sudan had its independence, and now they're pitting South Sudanese against each other. So which part of that South Sudanese community do you really want to arm? No, none of them. So guns in South Sudan should not be allowed right now. And it is the proliferation of these small arms, and really not even just small arms and others, that has really made it very complicated, have made it very complicated to find peace in South Sudan. Okay, because they can't even account. There are so many soldiers. Remember when they were still in the cantonment sites, when they were receiving training, because of the bad conditions, the lack of food, the lack of treatment, the lack of proper living conditions. Some of the soldiers that were being held in these cantonment sites, training and waiting to pass out, which took so many years to be done, left some of these sites and went back to the villages and to their communities with these guns. And after they did that, now they formed other smaller militias and they're being used by the politicians. And then bring in the issue of ethnicity, that also is a huge dividing factor in the Sudanese communities, so in the South Sudanese communities. So it is a lot. It is a lot there that needs to be looked at, and other factors and aspects of this conflict that needs to be addressed first before we can decide whether South Sudan arms embargo is ready to be lifted or not. But for right now, and for how things are moving in South Sudan, I don't think this arms embargo needs to be lifted. You know, when I was reading through this story and just putting it down, I was thinking perhaps it's time. But the more I talk about it and I look at the factors and I look at what's happening in South Sudan, I realize, no, it might be a little too soon. For Somalia, it is debatable. It is debatable, and the government has been making... South Sudan is lobbying other members to support its bid to have its arms embargo lifted. But for Somalia, it's just been coming out, and the government, by the new president, Mahmoud, has been saying, hey, we are trying to fight Al-Shabaab. We are trying to get rid of Al-Shabaab, and we are indeed we're making progress, but we need to be equipped enough. We need effective equipments and ammunition to be able to fight Al-Shabaab. But you know what is really interesting? The U.S. is a member of the Security Council and understands very well this arms embargo. They're the ones who vote to cement these things there in the United Nations Security Council. And yet a country like the U.S. is constantly bringing in arms and all this. So it into Somalia. You could argue for good reasons. I mean, we've seen the drones from the U.S. fighting. But if a country has been placed under arms embargo, no any other country is supposed to be trading with this country and exchanging any form of arms, or giving it, or trading, or selling to it, or gifting it in any form. So the U.S. already is violating the terms of the arms embargo as they are at the United Nations Security Council. The U.S. is violating this, okay? Is it not earlier this year that it gifted Somalia with, equipment and stuff for fighting the Al-Shabaab? So that is a direct violation of the arms embargo. Okay, so why don't you just allow then Somalia to be in a position to buy its own arms? I don't know if it can afford it. I don't know whether you're going to buy food and feed your people who are dying from famine, or you're going to invest more on arms. I don't know which one is urgent. But if you are gifting Somalia these arms, if you, U.S., a member of the United Nations Security Council, has no problem providing Somalia with this ammunition, despite the fact that it's under our arms embargo. So what is the qualm? Why wouldn't you just lift the arms embargo and just allow Somalia then to get the arms where it should get, and perhaps that will help it? Because you're violating you're violating the arms embargo anyway, United States and these other countries. And so it's meant, this arms embargo the sanction is meant to come to end the end of this month. And for me, next month, the arms embargo on South Sudan will be up for review. And just like Mogadishu, they hope that the arms embargo will be lifted. For me, I think for Juba, that is South Sudan, that arms embargo should stay. That arms embargo should stay. You cannot give more arms to a leadership that is so unstable, even within itself, okay? You cannot give arms to a regime that has not shown proper leadership and has not shown its commitment to the stability of a country. I think that we will be having more problems, and if anything, we do have the United Nations mission in South Sudan. Can we change their mandate maybe and just see that they're more effective in how they operate there in South Sudan? So I brought you the latest on this issue of Sudan. I think we talked about it at length earlier in the morning. It is a developing story, but the latest that I'm receiving here is that fierce clashes have been reported across Sudan as fighting between rival armed factions continues to spread. Violence between the army and the paramilitary group called the Rapid Support Force RSF has continued into the third day. Nearly 100 people have been killed, a doctors' union has confirmed, and one estimated put the number of injured at 1,100. Both sides claim to control key sites in the capital Khartoum, where residents sheltered from explosions. There has been violence around the country's famous seat of power, the Republican Palace, and the army admits that there are clashes around its Khartoum headquarters, but says it is still in control of all its bases. Army airstrikes have been targeting RSF bases, some of which are embedded in residential areas. Alarmed neighbors, that will be my country, Kenya, South Sudan, and Djibouti, are planning to send their presidents to help mediate in the crisis. However, are they still planning, or they should be there by right now, but they're still planning, okay, under IGAD. Mediate their crisis. However, this is not currently possible because Khartoum airport is closed. So that is the reason why the presidents of these three countries have not been able to go to Sudan. The US, EU, and UK have called for an immediate end to the fighting. On Sunday, both sides held a temporary ceasefire to allow the wounded to be evacuated, although it was not clear how strictly they stuck to it. Doctors warned that the situation at hospitals in Khartoum was extremely difficult and that the fighting was stopping both staff and medical supplies from reaching injured people. According to Sudan's Doctors Union, a wayward shell hit a hospital south of the capital, causing no injuries, but this has not been independently verified. Sudan State TV is now back on air and broadcasting pro-army songs and anthems after many hours without transmission. It abruptly went out of transmission yesterday. The fighting is part of a vicious power struggle within the country's military leadership, which has escalated into violence between rival factions. Okay, so that is the current situation there from Sudan. Indeed, our prayers are with the people of Sudan. Now you find that it is the civilian side that is now trying to mediate between the paramilitary group, RSF, and the military. So they're taking on at each other. And I don't want to get so much into the details because I talked about it so much in the morning, but it is a developing story. So perhaps when we come back here tomorrow, we shall have heard the latest, and maybe they would have calmed down. There will be a cessation of hostilities, perhaps. That is our prayers. But, you know, we just hope that this does not escalate from what it is right now. But as it is now, there's no telling what way, which trajectory this conflict will take. And hopefully Sudan will not plunge into a civil war. Like, this region has seen enough already. You know, we're just recovering from another war, conflict in Ethiopia. We're trying to help Somalia stabilize. I mean, South Sudan is here now, and now we have Sudan. Surely, this is too much. So hopefully, something can be done very quickly so that further escalation can be controlled. I want to thank you so much for your time this afternoon. Enjoy the rest of your day. My name is Miriam Mugutu. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.